Okay, let's engine performance test. What do you know? This is not going to take very long. How far apart are the firing events and degrees of crankshaft rotation on a 6-cylinder engine?
120.
120, because how'd you get them 120?
Because it's 720 and you divide it into 6.
Very good. 720 divided by 6 is going to give you the amount of firing. How far apart the firing is. How far is 120 degrees in a circle? Everybody look up here. That's not exact because I don't have my protractor, but that's 120. You're going to have a firing event here, and one here. And you're going to have cylinders. You know, 2 cylinders are going to fire here. Every time a piston comes up, its companion's coming up too. And when its companion comes up, it's going to be on exhaust and it's going to be on compression. And then when its companion is on compression, it's going to be exhaust. Because it's going up during exhaust and during compression, right? Those are the 2 upstrokes, or exhaust and compression. The 2 downstrokes are intake and power, right? Compression, power, intake, and exhaust. Remember that. That's the suck, squeeze, bang, blow thing. Okay, I want a 4-cylinder. How far apart are they?
180.
180, which is a half. This is a 6-cylinder. On a 180, you have one. They're going to be here and here, right? Okay, and what about an 8-cylinder?
90.
90 degrees, and all you got to do is take a 4 and do that with it, right? Okay, on a 10-cylinder?
72.
72 degrees. Oh goodness, what is 72 degrees? What do you think? 72 degrees is going to be what, Adam? About like that?
I have no idea.
And that, and that, and that, and that, and that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, I can't even do that. I'd have to get my protractor out to give you 72 degrees. I will tell you though that this is 45, so 72 is going to be something like that, basically. All right. How does the powertrain control module control, excuse me, what does the oxygen sensor sense?
Oxygen.
That's right. And a lot of people, let me hit you with this. People will get confused by that. I've seen mechanics get confused. The teacher will say, I'm running my engine, the oxygen sensor is giving me, the oxygen sensor signal as the engine is running is supposed to be going between lean and rich, like this, you know. And you know, the newer ones they come out with, they're slightly different, but they all basically are doing this with this is 0, and this is 1, and this is right in the middle. This is what it's basically going on both sides of all the time. It's supposed to go up and down. You're going to see little camel humps like that. All right, so basically, they say, okay, up is rich, down is lean, right? So if I pull a vacuum hose, this signal is going to go down, right? Then your fuel trim begins to kick in and starts to add fuel to overcome that vacuum leak, and then it starts switching again. Long fuel trim will be high, short fuel trim will be close to 0 if things are like they're supposed to be, if you've made a vacuum leak. All right, what if I've got a spark plug that has stopped firing? Let's say the spark plug, something happened, and that spark plug just quit firing. What happens to the oxygen sensor voltage then? Does it go to the rich side or does it go to the lean side?
Rich side.
Why would it go to the rich side if it's just smelling oxygen?
Hmm?
You know what I mean? It's not smelling fuel, remember that. I mean, it can be confusing if you don't think about it. What's actually coming out of that cylinder along with that unburned fuel is oxygen, and that's all the oxygen sensor cares about. It couldn't care less. Now what can happen, the oxygen sensor perceives a lean condition and it ramps all the other, you know, fuel trims up to try to try to take care of this, what it perceives as a lean condition. But you've also got the engine controller measuring misfires. And so all of that's got to be factored in too. There's a lot of algorithms going on there. So anyway, how does the powertrain control module control the amount of fuel delivered to the cylinders on a fuel-injected engine? Remember what we talked about in the electronics portion? Pulse width? No. Whenever the crank sensor, the crank sensor is what tells the computer how often to fire the injectors. If you're listening to the injectors in the engine idling, the injectors are going click, 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 click. As you speed the engine up, they go click, 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 click. They go faster and faster. But that is modified. That pulse of those injector pulse is modified by engine coolant temperature, intake air temperature, load, which is from your map or your MAF, and a number of other factors, you know. Basically, all of that's calculated to expand or contract the pulse width based on engine load and demand and all that kind of stuff. On a carburetor, whenever you would open the throttle plate, more air would go past the Vendier and it would pull more fuel out of there by default. But the fuel, you just put by controlling and fuel injector pulse width is what you're going to put down there. How is fuel delivery during engine starting different from fuel delivery right after the engine starts? Whenever you're, who's driven a vehicle with a carburetor on it? Anybody in here? What do you have to do when you first get in a vehicle with a carburetor on it?
Turn the key. And prime the gas.
Yeah, you tap the gas pedal. And you tap the gas pedal, there's an accelerator pump that actually is a physical pump, and it squirts gas. And that carburetor on this 350 out here that we play around with, you can look down in there and you can operate the throttle and see 2 streams of gas squirting in there. That wets the intake manifold because you got to have more gas to get it started. Now on a fuel injected engine, it double pulses the injectors when you're starting. And there's a ton of people out there that don't even know that, you know. But there was a lady that had and this is a cool story, so bear with me. Brings her little Toyota, no, what in the world was it? It was some kind of a Nissan or something. I can't remember what it was. Maybe an old Altima. It was like a 97 model. She brings it in here and she says, this thing starts really, really hard when it's cold. And I've had it at such and such a shop, whatever shop it was. He's done a bunch of work and he's wanting to charge me $500 or $600, but he's not fixed anything. It still starts really hard when it's cold. The rest of the day it starts pretty good. And I just kind of thought about it a little bit, and I said, I wonder what it's doing with those injectors. And I noticed that whenever you were spinning it over, the injectors were just going click, 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 like it was idling real slow, but they're actually supposed to all click at the same time. And so I went to the engine controller and I found out that there was no start signal at the engine controller when you turned it to start, so it didn't know you were starting. It just thought it was running real slow. It wasn't put enough gas in there to get it started, you see. And so I looked at the wiring schematic and I noticed there was a fuse that was feeding that start signal on the engine controller. And then I went over here and I saw that somebody had jerked that fuse out and put it somewhere else because their radio didn't work or something. So I put a fuse in it and then it would fire up just like it was supposed to. That's a true story. That happened right here. But see, I'm going to tell you this. I thought about that for I checked all the basic stuff and I didn't change any parts. Thought about it for several days before I did anything with it. That was the whole point, you know. All right, so, but just remember that when you're spinning it over, it's going to give you more injector pulses spinning. It also adds a few injector pulses when you crack the throttle too that are not synchronized with crank. If you're looking at, if you happen to be able to look at that on a sort of a square wave pattern, you know, if something is measuring them fast enough, you'll see additional fuel injector squirts that are not synchronized with crank. It's giving you, because it needs to have that accelerator pump squirt, and it does that with the injectors, okay? And furthermore, here's another thing. Let me tell you this, because this is engine performance. My buddy Donnie was working on a van, and he says, this van, when you crank it up, it runs rich as a dog. It fires up and it just runs rich and boils out a bunch of smoke. And other than that, it seems to run okay. And so we got to investigating that, and what we determined was when you first started it, the throttle position sensor, instead of staying steady at, you know, at closed throttle, even though nobody's moving the throttle, it had gone bad and it was drifting around just above closed throttle on its own. And the engine controller was saying, well, somebody's working the throttle, I need to give it some extra pulses. See what I mean? I mean, understanding that was the key to fixing that van. And it wasn't hard to fix, but finding out what was wrong with it without throwing a bevy of parts of it was what was important. And that's what I'm trying to teach you here, is how to sort out cause and effect and think clearly. You know, and Adam and me are, you know, fighting a Buick over here that's some numbers aren't lining up on. Incidentally, let me tell you this. Every time you get a chance to plug a scan tool into a car that's running right, you probably should do it, because if you're used to seeing a bad one, I mean a good one, you can spot a bad one a whole lot easier. I could put a scan tool in your hand. If you haven't looked at those numbers before, you're not going to be able to pick it out if it doesn't throw you a code. And there's a lot of times it'll have a problem. There'll be no code. Or there'll be a code and you'll go off in the wrong direction. A lot of people will throw an oxygen sensor at it when they get a P0172 code. And that's not, you know, that's not the right way to handle that typically. When engine load goes up, Which way does vacuum go? Engine vacuum goes. And why do we have engine vacuum to begin with? Throttle plate's closed, pistons are working against that closed throttle plate. You got high vacuum at an idle. When I crack the throttle, which way does the vacuum go? Do you get more vacuum or less? If you watch a vacuum gauge, you're going to see it at 18 to 22 inches. When it's idling, you crack the throttle, it's going to drop. Got me? All right. When engine and air temperatures are cold, the air-fuel mixture must be what?
Leaner.
Actually, it's got to be richer, because think about it, the carburetor, you close the choke, right? That's going to make it richer. You're cutting off some of the air, letting it have more fuel. Now, here's the other problem. Right now, we've got the Bronco out there is actually skipping on one cylinder because it's been started and shut off too many times cold. Anytime you start vehicles and move them, that's why I say whenever you're moving one of our trainer vehicles, let it warm up before you shut it off. That may seem time consuming, but I've seen used car lots that will bring cars to the shop that won't start. And when we check them, it's because they've cranked it up and moved it from this place to that place and this place to that place, and they moved them around a lot, and they wet the spark plugs. And so you just got to put plugs in it or clean the ones that are in there. You know, we got to think a way of doing that. And the Bronco right now, I guarantee if you pull the plugs out, you're probably going to find a wet one or two in there. That happened to the Sonata a couple of years ago. I mean, they got to where it completely wouldn't start because people had cranked it up, and they'd move it, they shut it off. Crank it up, move it, shut it off. And it finally fouled every one of those spark plugs. And they're not going to get cleaned by themselves. Now, if they're really greasy and really wet. Now, sometimes you can hold the fuel gas pedal all the way to the floor, and when you spin it over, that air going, that shuts off the fuel injectors on most cars. And whenever you're spinning it over and that air's going in there, it'll dry the plugs off enough to where they'll start firing sometimes, and then you can fire it up like that. But let me ask you this. What if your throttle position sensor failed so that it was reading wide open throttle all the time? You may well have a no start, right? Because it's going to shut the fuel injectors off, right? That's another thing. Okay, let me see. As you apply throttle and increase engine speed with no load, what does the ignition timing, the spark timing do?
Advances.
It advances. Why does it need to advance? What is one of the constants? You know, you got constants and variables. Your variable is your engine speed, right? But your constant is the speed at which the fuel will burn. So if you're going to get the maximum amount of power out of that mix, you're going to have to light it off sooner. The spark should have to happen earlier so that it will actually give you your optimum power. Retarded ignition timing causes low engine vacuum, believe it or not, and it'll also cause you to have, you know, low power and all that. So let me see. Late valve. Oh, incidentally, when you're on the road, like on my Taurus, and this is a cool thing to do with this little thing that I was showing you all. If you look at your ignition timing driving down the highway when you're just floating along at like 55, 60 miles an hour, your ignition timing is going to be between 38 and 50 degrees usually. It's really, really high. When you go into a heavy load, though, it drops back to prevent ping, you know, the labor knock, like a bad gas rattle. Late valve timing, late ignition timing, and EGR flow all have the same effect. That's low engine vacuum. However, if you've got a big enough vacuum leak, you'll also have low engine vacuum for that reason. What is meant by closed loop fuel control? We talked about that yesterday.
It means if it's closed loop, it means it's reading the oxygen sensor.
Yeah, the oxygen sensor is in the loop. All right, here's what you got here. You got basically you got fuel going in. PCM is putting the fuel in. The engine is processing the fuel. Coming out of your exhaust, you got an oxygen sensor in there that's sniffing that exhaust on the way out. PCM's reading that. Okay, and it continual. That's a closed loop. If the engine is cold, or if you're at wide open throttle, or if there's a problem where the PCM knows it can't trust the oxygen sensor is out of the loop, and the PCM is taking inputs from other places, leaving the oxygen sensor out of the equation, right? So that's open loop. When you first start it, it usually won't go into closed loop until the engine gets pretty warm. If you get a P0125 or a P0128 code, it typically means the engine's running too cold, and if it's running too cold, it's going to spend too much time in open loop, and that's going to hurt your fuel economy and emissions and all that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind. That's what the difference between open and closed loop was. I learned what open and closed loop was in 1981 at a General Motors school, and the lady that was the instructor was really sharp. But I worked places after that where there were veteran mechanics that didn't understand what open and closed loop were. They didn't have a clue, and they never really asked anybody because they didn't want to seem dumb. You know what I mean? And the reason I'm saying that is if you've ever got a question, then it's really wise to go ahead and ask the question, right? David Browner. We'll call him back in a minute. All right. Now then, let me see. Carburetors had an accelerator pump that applied additional fuel charge through squirt jets as the throttle was open. I was talking about that just a minute ago. How does a fuel injection engine handle the need for additional fuel during throttle open? I told you it adds injector pulses that aren't there, that aren't synchronized with the crank. Why is it a good idea to check tire pressures on a vehicle when you're performing what customers and shops usually call a tune-up? If they're saying do me a tune-up, you're basically talking nowadays about, throttle body, check for codes, replace your spark plugs, this kind of thing pretty much. It's basically an engine health check and try to bring it back to where it was supposed to be. Fuel filter, that sort of stuff. But if a lot of people drive around, they don't hardly ever check their tire pressures, especially if they don't have a tire pressure monitor. You put their tire pressures back where they're supposed to be, the car is going to be crisp, it's going to accelerate good, it's going to feel good, and they're going to say, man, that tune-up made a lot of difference. And a lot of the deal is they were running 20 pounds of air in their tires, and now they got the 35 they were supposed to have or whatever. It's a good practice. Also, when you're doing an oil change, if you can get to it, like on pickups and whatever, it's not a bad idea to check the tire and the air in the spare tire. Adam Snap, the other guy that subs for me sometimes, whenever he's working on one and doing an oil change, he always checks the air in the spare. Hey, Brian, move that motor so it don't fall. It looks like it's right on the edge and it may be about to fall, that little electric motor. Okay. Finally, number 12, why is it a bad idea to ignore the malfunction indicator light, even if you know what's wrong and it's not a serious problem? Because the problem there is
you might see it again later and think it was wrong.
Stuff piles up. You might say, oh, well, I know what's wrong with that. I'll just fix that later. You keep driving it. Next thing you know, when it finally starts running bad, and you check it, and you say, oh, my goodness, now I'm going to need this, now I'm going to need that. I didn't know all that other stuff was wrong, because when the light came on, unless it's flashing because of a misfire, it only knows how to burn one way. It's not going to tell you I've got 5 codes, 8, 9. It's going to tell you I got 1, and then the other ones are going to pile up behind it. So it's a good idea to deal with that malfunction indicator light early on. That's what I usually tell a customer that's thinking that way. All right. Okay, that winds us up on that.